often find ourselves explaining things that seem obvious to us, only to find that others don't follow our explanations. And I think this meme shows that. Maybe you've tried to explain something to an older member of your family, only to have him or her not understand. Or maybe it's worked in the opposite direction too. Uh, Here's some other related examples of this phenomenon. There's this experiment that researchers have done repeatedly. If you show a child some pencils in a candy box, the child will first act surprised. But a few minutes later, assume other children will also know pencils are in the box. Eventually, he will swear he knew there were pencils there all along. Other studies have shown that adults tend to estimate others will learn how to use their own cell phone in half the time they themselves needed to learn how to use it. There's another classic experiment called the Tapper experiment. One person was asked to tap out the beat of a common song, like Happy Birthday, here it is, while a listener tried to guess which song it was. Well, the tappers predicted the listeners would guess correctly 50% of the time. Only 2.5% of the guesses were correct. Also related, most people don't like reading academic papers, legal documents, technical documents. Pinker has a good take on this, on what's going on here. He calls this the curse of knowledge. It's a difficulty in imagining what it's like for someone else not to know something that you know. This is a psychological shortcoming that affects all humans. There's this idea that, academics and lawyers and engineers, their writing is the way it is because they want to show off how smart they are. They want to dress up bad ideas in fancy prose, or they want to get revenge, on the people who used to bully them. Pinker disagrees with that perspective. And he has, this is a really great quote he has here, never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. A practical example of this in our daily lives might be that, somebody doesn't invite you to a party, and your first instinct might be to think that they're a terrible person, but maybe they just forgot, But in terms of, the difficult writing that we see in academia or legal or technical documents, here's, Pinker's point of view is it's not that they're bad people, they're good people, but their writing stinks because the better you know something, the harder it is to remember what it's like not to know about that thing. That's what the curse of knowledge is. Once you understand something, it's very difficult to go back to that state of mind where you didn't understand it, and that's where our readers often are. The curse of knowledge really plays out in three ways. A basic way is with technical terms and jargon. For instance, we get used to acronyms like SALT. Maybe that means the Strategic Arms Limitation talks. Here's another example. I went to a parent-teacher conference with my wife, who was working at the school that my daughter was attending at the time. And, the teachers kept talking about AOEs. Well, AOEs are coming up, and we're all excited about the AOEs. And my wife said, yeah, I'm excited about the AOEs too. And we got through the whole parent-teacher conference, and the teacher said, do you have any questions? And I said, yeah, I have a question. What's an AOE? Oh, and everyone kind of laughed a little bit. Well, it turns out that AOE stands for Area of Expertise. Everyone who worked at the school knew what they were. I was an outsider. I didn't know what they were. This is the sort of thing that we can define for a reader or a listener. But this also includes just using simple terms. There's, why say murine models if you could just say rats or mice? If you do have to use a technical term, just throw in a quick definition of it right afterwards. And like always, be mindful of your reader. Pinker has a good point here. If one biologist is writing to another, they don't need to explain, what a transcription factor is. But maybe other things that they might. Here's an example of how this can play out in student writing. Well, look at how the student launches into the SSM. Well, if you've done some reading in Miller and Kanazawa, you'll get maybe what that reference is. Most people won't. Here's some jargon that we can spell out. Another example of how the curse of knowledge plays out is through a phenomenon that we'll call chunking. Take a look at this string of letters. If I asked you to memorize this string of letters, how well do you think you would do? You might struggle, right? But what about this? MD, PhD, RSVP, CEO, IHOP. You could even make a little story about it. The MD and the PhD RSVP to the CEO of IHOP. Why is it easier? This is the same string of letters. Why is it easier to remember it here than it is here? Well, that's because the human brain can only really hold about 3 to 5 pieces of information at a time. So we take strings of complex information and we put them into chunks. And that allows us to process complex thought. The problem is that our readers often don't have the same chunks as us. Now, let me give you an example. If I ask you, well, what do you think about the current administration's policy on quantitative easing? You might not have a whole lot to say. You might draw a blank. That's okay. That's because there's a lot of chunks of knowledge that you have to possess in order to understand what quantitative easing is. Now, what if I told you that, if I have something and you have something, I can give you the thing that I have. If you also give me the thing that you have, then we've done something called trading. Now, if I give you the thing that I have and you give me something in return that I'm going to hold on to use later, now we can understand this concept of selling. And if a lot of people are doing the same practice with a particular product, now we have a market. And if we look at lots and lots of markets and how they all come together, now we have an economy. Now, if you understand an economy as something that can be influenced by government action, now you understand monetary policy. And if you understand monetary policy, you can know that the government will occasionally buy up physical assets in order to influence the economy. That's quantitative easing. Once I've got you through the chunks here, you're ready to understand what quantitative easing is. If you're my 7-year-old daughter, you're probably somewhere around this point here. She'll come home from the library and say, well, I bought some new books. And we have, technically you didn't buy them. Actually, no. Here's an example of what this looks like in student writing, this idea of chunking. Take a look at the passage. Well, because of natural and sexual selection, we're heavily influenced by the experiences of our cave person ancestors. Okay? They lived under very different circumstances than we do today. They faced many threats, had to face scarcity, and had to make decisions that would ensure their survival and the survival of their offspring. As a result, we think and act in very much the same way as our ancestors. This can be considered human nature. These are all valid statements, but we're skipping over some steps here. Like our ancestors made some decisions, and we think the same way they do? How did we get from point A to point B? We are skipping over some steps in the process, right? There's something here about survival of the fittest, and how if you have a preference that's beneficial to your survival, and then if you survive, you can pass that preference on to your offspring. Then your offspring will probably have the preference because the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And then the preference can become standard over time. We're skipping over steps, much like someone who just jumps in and asks you about quantitative easing might be as well. Here is another way that the curse of knowledge plays out. It's fixation on function. Let's start with a practical example of it. What do kids do with wrapping paper and gift boxes that adults never do? They play with it. Kids will just play with stuff, right? They'll go in the kitchen, they'll get the pots and pans, and they'll just play with them. Adults don't do that. Well, why is that? That's because the brain has a natural tendency to focus on what things do rather than what they are, and it gets worse over time. To an adult, the gift box has served its purpose. It's a box. It held the gift. Let's throw it out. Kids don't see any such limitation. It could be a fire station. It could be a mountain. Here's another example of this, the candle problem. All right, this is a classic psychology test. You give people these components, book of matches, box of tacks, and a candle, and the task is this. You must attach the candle to the wall and light it, but no wax may drip on the floor. Adults tend to struggle with this. Children come to the solution fairly quickly. What you do is you dump out the tacks, you use the tacks to mount the box on the wall, then you put the candle on the box, and then you light it. Adults struggle with this because they see the box as something that holds tacks. Children don't see the limitation. They're quicker to see that the box can serve other purposes. And that's why they usually beat adults. They even beat like MBA students in this experiment. Um, this whole fixation on function thing plays out all the time in academic writing. Pinker mentions this one experiment where a psychologist in the actual experiment was showing people sentences, and then he asked them to describe each sentence as true or false. When he wrote about his experiment, he didn't mention this whole I showed them true or false things. He just called them assessment words because that's what they were there to do. True or false were there to assess the sentences. But readers who read this report had no idea what an assessment word meant in this context. Here's another example that Pinker gives. The slow and integrative nature of conscious perception is confirmed behaviorally by observations such as the rabbit illusion and its variants, where the way in which a stimulus is ultimately perceived is influenced by post-stimulus events arising several hundreds of milliseconds after the original stimulus. Does that confuse you? It confuses me. What we're focusing on is what things do rather than what they are. What things actually are in this experiment is something called where you take someone's arm and then you tap it on the wrist and then you tap it on a few other places up the arm. And that creates this thing called the rabbit illusion where it feels like a rabbit's running up your arm. See, if we explain what things actually are instead of what they do, it makes a lot more sense, right? This plays out in student writing too. Here are some examples of it, all right? There's evidence within the field of evolutionary psychology that humans naturally prefer a particular type of landscape. And then we get some information about what that landscape does. It does this. It resembles the African savanna. Okay, but what is it? What's it look like? How can you help readers visualize what this landscape is like? Here's another example of it. Here's some information about what bad smells do. Okay, yeah, sure, bad smells might be a sign of contamination, but why not just give some examples of what bad smells are, like rotting eggs? That helps people understand. Interestingly, fixation on function can hold us back in business. There's this classic business case study about a company called Marlin Steel. They made fast food baskets, the sort of metal baskets that you put French fries or chicken sticks in before you fry them up. And they were getting crushed by foreign competition. One day, by chance, the CEO of the company met a Boeing executive, Boeing, the company that makes airplanes. And this Boeing executive mentioned, we need these baskets that can hold these like tiny little super complex parts in our factory, but we have trouble finding them. And then, the owner of Marlin Steel realized, I'm thinking about my products the wrong way. I look at it and think it's a fast food basket. No, it's not. It's a thing that can hold stuff. What else could I do with it, right? Now they make high-end baskets for manufacturers like Boeing. How can we avoid the curse of knowledge in our writing? Well, one thing and Pinker's mentioned this before, we can use concrete descriptions of real people doing real things. Let's see some examples of this in business. Trader Joe's is an example. In their training materials, they avoid abstract language like target customer. This is what they tell people. Picture an unemployed college professor who drives a very, very used Volvo. That puts a picture in the mind. That helps the trainees relate and understand. Another example is FedEx. In their training materials, rather than abstract language like excellence and commitment, they tell a story, true story about a driver whose delivery truck broke down. She proceeded to deliver packages on foot. And then she even convinced a driver for a rival company to help her finish her route. That's a story that people can always point back to. They can understand and relate to it. We can also use language effectively. We can use standard sentence structure. Human agents as grammatical subjects. In other words, people are doing the actions, right? And that is much easier to understand than passive voice. Instead of it was confirmed or it is perceived or experiment, we can why not just say what people were doing? Well, the experiment is confirmed. Test subjects perceived. We can also avoid things like nominalizations. These are also known as zombie nouns. This is where we take something that makes a perfectly good verb, like we observed, we assessed, and we turn it into a noun, like an assessment was made of an observation in which. That's just harder to understand. Here's a paragraph that came from a student who really just shows shows all these things here. Take a look at, take a look at some of the language. Everyone knows men prefer women with long hair, large breasts, and small waists. This doesn't mean everyone knows why men find these traits attractive. In the case of a woman's body, what makes it attractive is youth, fertility, and health, which are connected. Notice how simple and straightforward the language is here, and notice how people are at the front of sentences doing the actions.